In just 29 seconds, one of Hollywood's most respected actors went from sitting on The View's couch to storming off set in what witnesses are calling the most explosive confrontation in daytime television history. A conversation that started as a discussion about Samuel L. Jackson's legendary career turned into a verbal takedown so intense that security had to step in. This is what really happened when Joy Behar pushed one of cinema's biggest stars too far. Before we dive into this chaos, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that get buried by the media machine. The hot seats on The View were filled last night, and Samuel L. Jackson sat across from the panel with his signature cool confidence. He wore his usual sharp outfit, looking relaxed as the show's theme music faded out. The audience clapped enthusiastically because everyone loves Samuel L. Jackson. He's done hundreds of movies, voiced characters in animations, and basically become a living legend in Hollywood. Joy Behar started the conversation with what seemed like a simple question about his new film project. Samuel answered smoothly, talking about the director's vision and how excited he was to be part of something meaningful. The other hosts smiled and nodded along. Everything appeared normal for those first few minutes, but then Joy shifted gears. She brought up a topic that had nothing to do with his movie. She started talking about something Samuel had said in an interview from years ago. Something about how actors should be allowed to play any role regardless of their background. It was an old conversation that had already been discussed 1,000 times before. Samuel's face changed slightly. You could see his jaw tighten just a little bit. He responded calmly at first, saying that his words had been taken out of context back then, and that the media had twisted what he actually meant. He explained his real position clearly and thoughtfully. Joy didn't let it go. She interrupted him mid-sentence, which is something you just don't do to Samuel L. Jackson. She said something along the lines of, "Well, that's not how it came across to a lot of people." Her tone had this edge to it, like she was accusing him of something. Samuel stopped talking and just stared at her for a moment. The studio got quiet. Even the other hosts seemed uncomfortable, glancing at each other with these worried expressions. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent. "I'm sorry, did you just cut me off?" Samuel asked. His voice was still controlled, but you could hear the warning in it. It was like when a teacher asks a question but you know they're actually telling you to stop what you're doing. Joy laughed it off with this dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, come on. We interrupt each other all the time on this show. Don't be so sensitive." That word, sensitive. You could see something flash across Samuel's face. His eyebrows went up, and he leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Sensitive?" he repeated slowly. "Nah, see, that's not what this is about. I was answering your question, and you decided my answer wasn't good enough before I even finished giving it." The other hosts tried to jump in to smooth things over, but Joy kept going. She brought up another old interview, this time from several years back, where Samuel had made comments about the film industry. She started questioning his positions, using this tone that made it sound like she was a prosecutor and he was on trial. Samuel's posture changed completely. He sat up straighter, and his voice got firmer. "Hold up. Are we here to talk about my new movie, or are you trying to put me on blast for stuff I said years ago that you clearly didn't understand then and still don't understand now?" Joy shot back. "I understand perfectly well. I'm just asking you to clarify your controversial statements." "Controversial to who?" Samuel asked. "Because I've been pretty damn clear about where I stand on everything. The problem is, you've got this narrative in your head, and you're trying to make me fit into it." The tension in the studio was thick now. You could feel it through the screen. The audience was dead silent. The other hosts were frozen, not knowing what to do. This had gone from a friendly interview to something else entirely. Joy tried to maintain control. She said something like, "Samuel, I'm just doing my job as a journalist. I ask tough questions." Samuel actually laughed at that, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that means someone has just said something ridiculous. "Journalist?" he said. "Is that what we're calling this? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels a lot more like an ambush than journalism." Joy's face flushed red. You could see she wasn't used to being challenged like this on her own show. She was used to guests backing down or playing along, but Samuel L. Jackson isn't most guests. "I don't ambush people," Joy said, her voice rising slightly. I have a responsibility to my viewers to ask important questions. Then ask important questions, Samuel fired back. Don't drag up old shit that you already know the answers to just so you can create some kind of moment for your show. One of the other hosts tried to interject, suggesting they take a quick break, but Joy wasn't having it. She kept pushing, bringing up yet another topic that had nothing to do with why Samuel was there. This time she mentioned something about his political views, something he'd posted on social media months ago. Samuel put his hand up to stop her. Okay, we're done with this, he said firmly. Excuse me? Joy said, looking shocked that someone would try to end the conversation. You heard me. We're done, Samuel repeated. I came here to talk about my work, to talk about this film that I'm proud of, that means something to me. Instead, you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to play gotcha with me like I'm some politician you're trying to catch in a lie. Joy's voice got even louder. You're being completely unreasonable. These are legitimate questions that people want answered. What people? Samuel asked, his voice cutting through hers. Because it seems like these are questions you want answered, so you can feel like you did something today. This isn't about information. This is about you trying to make yourself look good by tearing someone else down. The audience gasped. Some people started murmuring to each other. The other hosts looked absolutely mortified. This was spiraling completely out of control. Joy stood up from her seat, pointing her finger at Samuel. How dare you come on my show and attack me like this? Samuel stood up too, his full height towering over the desk. Attack you? Lady, I haven't attacked anyone. I've been defending myself against your bullshit for the last 15 minutes. There's a difference. You need to watch your language, Joy snapped. This is daytime television, and you need to watch your manners, Samuel shot back. You don't invite someone to your house and then spend the whole time disrespecting them. That's not how this works. Joy's hands were shaking now. She was furious. If you don't like my questions, there's the door. The studio went completely silent. Everyone knew what she'd just done. She'd basically told one of Hollywood's biggest stars to leave her show. Samuel L. Jackson looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the other hosts, who all had their eyes down, clearly embarrassed by what was happening. He looked out at the audience, many of whom were shaking their heads. You know what? Samuel said, his voice eerily calm now. I think I'll take you up on that. He reached down and unclipped the microphone from his shirt. He carefully placed it on the table in front of him, making sure not to just throw it down, even though you could tell he wanted to. Joy seemed shocked that he was actually leaving. Wait, you're seriously walking out? Samuel looked at her one more time. Yeah, I am. Because I don't have to sit here and be disrespected. I don't care whose show this is. I don't care how long you've been doing this. There's a way to treat people, and this ain't it. This is ridiculous, Joy said. But her voice sounded weaker now, less sure of herself. What's ridiculous, Samuel said, moving toward the side of the set, is that you think you can treat guests like this, and it's okay because you're the host. Newsflash. It's not okay. It's never been okay. One of the producers rushed over, trying to talk to Samuel, probably begging him to stay or trying to smooth things over. But Samuel just shook his head and kept walking. Joy called out after him. You're making a big mistake. Samuel stopped and turned around one last time. The cameras were still rolling, catching every second of this disaster. The only mistake I made, Samuel said, his voice carrying across the entire studio, was thinking this was going to be a respectful conversation. You don't want a conversation. You want a victim. And I'm nobody's victim. Joy tried to respond, but Samuel held up his hand to silence her. I've been in this industry for decades, he continued. I've worked with the best directors, the best actors, the best crews in the world. I've earned my respect through my work, through treating people right, through showing up and doing the job. You don't get to diminish that because you want some viral moment for your show. That's not what I was trying to do, Joy protested. But everyone in that studio knew she was lying. Yes, it was, Samuel said flatly. That's exactly what you were trying to do. And you know what? It backfired. Because now, instead of talking about my film, instead of having a real conversation about the work I love, we're standing here having this pointless argument that didn't need to happen. The other hosts finally found their voices. One of them said, Samuel, please, we can start over. We can talk about your movie. But Samuel shook his head. Nah, the damage is done. You can't unring that bell. Joy jumped back in, her voice defensive now. I was just asking questions that needed to be asked. No, Samuel said firmly. You were asking questions that you wanted to ask. There's a difference. A good interviewer knows how to challenge someone without disrespecting them. A good interviewer knows how to dig deep without digging someone's grave. You ain't doing good interviewing. You're doing character assassination. That is completely unfair, Joy said, her voice shaking with emotion. Is it? Samuel asked. Because, from where I'm standing, you invited me here under false pretenses. You said we'd talk about my new project. Instead, you ambushed me with a bunch of old controversial topics that you already had your mind made up about. You weren't looking for my perspective. You were looking for me to slip up so you could pounce. The audience was completely captivated now. Some people were nodding in agreement with Samuel. Others looked shocked by the whole situation. But everyone was paying attention. Joy tried to regain control of the situation. You're being paranoid. Not everything is an attack. Samuel laughed again. That same humorless laugh from before. Paranoid, lady? I've been black in Hollywood for 40 years. I know what an attack looks like. And this was an attack. One of the other hosts tried to mediate. Maybe we can all just take a breath and... There's nothing to breathe about, Samuel interrupted. This is over. I'm done. Joy's face was bright red now. She was embarrassed, angry, and defensive all at once. Fine. Leave then. See if I care. Samuel stopped walking again and looked at her with something that almost looked like pity. You should care, he said quietly. Because what just happened here? This is going to follow you. People are going to see this and they're going to judge you for it. And they should. Because you had an opportunity to have a real conversation with someone, and instead, you chose to play games. Get out! Joy shouted, completely losing her composure now. The other hosts looked horrified. The producers were rushing around, trying to figure out what to do. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every single second of this meltdown. Samuel didn't rush. He didn't storm off in anger. He walked calmly and deliberately toward the exit, his head held high. But before he left the set completely, he turned back one final time. You know what the sad thing is? He said. I actually used to respect this show. I used to think it was a place where real conversations could happen, but you've turned it into a circus. And I'm not a clown. With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the View set. The camera stayed on Joy Behar, who stood there looking absolutely stunned. The other hosts tried to quickly go to commercial, stumbling over their words as they attempted to salvage what was left of the show. But the damage was done. In less than a minute, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors had been pushed to his limit by a host who thought she could control the narrative. Joy had wanted a moment, and she got one, just not the kind she was hoping for. As Samuel disappeared behind the curtain, you could see stagehands and crew members watching in disbelief. Some of them were clearly on Samuel's side, nodding as he passed by. Others just looked shocked that things had escalated so quickly. Joy tried to compose herself, smoothing down her clothes and fixing her hair. But her hands were still shaking. She sat back down at the desk, but she couldn't hide the embarrassment on her face. The other hosts were silent, not knowing what to say or how to react. The audience was buzzing with energy. People were talking to each other, pointing at the empty chair where Samuel had been sitting just minutes before. This was clearly not what anyone had expected when they came to watch a taping of The View. One of the producers came over and whispered something to Joy. She nodded, but you could see the anger still burning in her eyes. She was furious that she'd lost control, furious that a guest had walked out on her, furious that she'd been called out so publicly. But Samuel was already gone. He'd walked away from the confrontation with his dignity intact, refusing to be disrespected on national television. He'd stood up for himself when someone tried to tear him down, and he'd done it without backing down or apologizing for demanding basic respect. The show eventually went to commercial, but the damage had been done. What was supposed to be a friendly interview promoting a new film had turned into one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. And it had all happened because Joy Behar had pushed the wrong person too far. Samuel L. Jackson had come to The View to talk about his work, his passion, his art. Instead, he'd been forced to defend himself against a host who seemed more interested in creating drama than having a real conversation. And when he'd finally had enough, when he'd finally said no more, he'd done what any self-respecting person would do. He'd walked away. The empty chair where Samuel had been sitting just moments before seemed to say everything that needed to be said. You can't treat people like garbage and expect them to just sit there and take it. You can't disrespect someone on your own show and think there won't be consequences. And you definitely can't go after Samuel L. Jackson and expect him to back down. Joy sat at that desk, looking smaller somehow than she had at the start of the show. The confidence she'd had earlier was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that she'd made a serious mistake. She'd underestimated her guest, underestimated his willingness to stand up for himself, and underestimated how badly this could go wrong. The other hosts tried to move on to the next segment, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Everyone was still thinking about what had just happened, still processing the fact that Samuel L. Jackson had just walked off The View in the middle of a live taping. Security guards, who had been called over, stood awkwardly near the sides of the set, unsure if they were still needed. The whole thing had ended so abruptly that nobody quite knew what to do next. The carefully planned show had been completely derailed by one confrontation that nobody had seen coming. Backstage, you could imagine Samuel collecting his things, probably shaking his head at the whole situation. He'd been in the industry long enough to know that some battles aren't worth fighting, but he'd also been around long enough to know when it was time to draw a line. And he'd drawn that line firmly and clearly. Joy tried to regain some semblance of control, making a comment to the audience about moving on with the show, but her voice lacked the usual spark. She knew, even if she wouldn't admit it, that she'd crossed a line. She'd treated a guest with disrespect, and that guest had refused to tolerate it. The lesson was clear, even if Joy wasn't ready to learn it yet. You can't treat people like they're beneath you just because you're the host. You can't ambush guests with old controversies when they came to talk about their current work, and you definitely can't expect someone like Samuel L. Jackson to sit there quietly while you try to make him look bad. As the show continued without him, Samuel's absence felt enormous. That empty chair was more powerful than anything anyone could say. It represented dignity, self-respect, and the refusal to be disrespected for the sake of entertainment. Joy had wanted a memorable show. She got one, just not in the way she'd planned. Instead of a friendly chat about movies and Hollywood, she'd created a confrontation that would be talked about for years. Instead of looking like a tough interviewer who asks hard questions, she'd looked like someone who didn't know where the line was between challenging and attacking. The View would go on, of course. They'd finish the episode, probably edit it heavily before it aired fully, and try to move past this disaster. But Samuel L. Jackson had made his point. He'd shown that, even in the world of talk shows and television politics, there were still people who wouldn't compromise their dignity for a paycheck or publicity. He'd walked onto that set as a guest. He'd walked off as someone who'd stood up for himself and refused to be diminished. And in doing so, he'd exposed exactly what was wrong with the confrontational style of interviewing that Joy had employed. You can't build yourself up by tearing others down. You can't create meaningful content through ambush tactics. And you can't expect legends to play along with your games. The chair remained empty. The show went on. But everyone in that studio knew they'd just witnessed something significant. They'd seen a man decide that his self-respect was more important than being polite. They'd seen someone refuse to be bullied, even by a host on her own show. They'd seen Samuel L. Jackson do what he does best, command respect through his presence and his unwillingness to accept anything less than what he deserves. Joy would have to face the consequences of what she'd done. The other hosts would have to figure out how to move forward. The producers would have to deal with the fallout. But Samuel was already gone, having made his statement clearly and powerfully. He didn't need to stick around for the aftermath. He'd said what needed to be said, and then he'd left on his own terms. That's how legends operate. They don't beg for respect. They don't argue endlessly trying to prove their point. They simply refuse to accept disrespect, and they walk away when the situation becomes untenable. Samuel L. Jackson had done exactly that, leaving behind a studio full of shocked people and one very embarrassed host who'd just learned a valuable lesson about who you can and cannot push around. The confrontation was over, but the impact would last much longer. Everyone who witnessed it, whether in the studio or watching from home, had seen what happens when someone finally says enough is enough. They'd seen what it looks like when a person values their dignity more than the opportunity to be on television. And they'd seen Joy Behar lose control of her own show because she'd pushed too hard against someone who wouldn't be pushed. As Samuel walked out of that building and into the daylight outside, he left behind chaos and confusion. But he also left behind a powerful message: treat people with respect, or don't be surprised when they refuse to stick around. It was a simple lesson, but one that apparently still needed to be taught. And Samuel L. Jackson had just taught it in the most dramatic way possible, walking away from the view and never looking back.